So now that we're done, now that we've talked a little bit about nationalism, I want to go back to independence. Some of the stuff I was talking about was pre-independence nationalism, and some of it was how nationalism was used after independence. But for all these, nationalism was really one of the sources of the fall of the Soviet Union. You had these ethnic-based republics that began to fragment away from the center, especially in the Baltics and in the Caucasus, so in Georgia and Armenia, where you had these elites who didn't want to be part of the Soviet Union anymore. You also had the same thing going on in Russia proper, where they didn't want to keep controlling these peripheries, which were really seen as drains on the income. And so you had the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, it's important to remember. So I'm sorry. What we'll talk about today is the context of independence, how the empire collapsed, and then major issues facing Central Asia upon independence: security, economics, foreign policy, and of course nationalism and the quote-unquote Russian problem. How do we deal with these large Russian minorities? This isn't something that just Central Asia has to deal with. This is something that all the countries, new independent countries from the post-Soviet bloc, have to deal with everywhere. So, at the end of the Soviet Union, remember that Gorbachev really fought to hold the Soviet Union together. He didn't want to see it break. Remember, from the very beginning, he was out to strengthen the Soviet Union. That was the whole point of Glasnost and Perestroika. And then at the end, as these various republics tried to get out, he tried to create a new union treaty, but he really failed to get the support. Many republics boycotted a referendum on this new union treaty, and he eventually lost power to a stronger Russian leader who created the Commonwealth of Independent States with Ukraine and Belarus, with the Minsk Declaration of 1991. A few days later, Central Asian heads met, and they were offended. They were dejected. They couldn't believe that the Soviet state had fallen without even their participation. And so they asked to join the Commonwealth, but as founding members. And so on December 21st, 11 states came to Almaty and signed on to this. And then Gorbachev finally resigned on December 25th, a few days later, 1991, and that was the end of the Soviet Union. So why were Central Asia's communists hesitant about independence? Why didn't they want to see the Soviet Union end? What did they prefer? Well, central elites were really just hoped for some sort of greater autonomy, some degree of independence that would leave all union structures in place. In other words, the federal structures in place. They wanted a more benevolent center, which would allow the Central Asian states more political and economic independence, but would ensure that Moscow would keep a stake in the region in exchange for continuing the status quo to some extent. And the status quo meant things like social services, this redistribution of funds from the center to the periphery. All of these Central Asian republics, except for Turkmenistan, favored some sort of integration in some kind of form. They wanted a significant degree of sovereignty, especially the primacy of local laws and control over republic resources and domestic and foreign policies, but they still wanted some sort of federal or confederal, I should say, ties with the center. One Tajik representative to that republic's Supreme Soviet commented that, quote, normal life is totally unimaginable unless we preserve the integrity of the Union. And it was unimaginable, because the way the Soviet Union was constructed, you had all these spokes that worked together to form a wheel that was moving. And without some of those, when you separated these spokes from the rest of the wheel, they sort of fell flat and they broke down, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. States in Central Asia saw independence calls as a tool for greater concession from Moscow. That's all they were. They didn't really want full-out independence. The Kyrgyz, which were the last, the Kyrgyz, which were the first state to declare independence, did so on August 31st. Interestingly, they were the last to become a republic as well, back in the 1930s. Uzbekistan continued to withhold support for an all-union agreement, hoping to get more. But independence was meant to bring about, again, more economic autonomy, to get Moscow to better appreciate and compensate the republics in the south. Gorbachev reacted to all this by giving more economic authority to the republics. For example, allowing the republics to court foreign investors in the dying days of the Soviet Union. When Gorbachev faced the August coup, August 1991, by hardliners trying to oust him, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan were silent. Some of them were outright supportive, but they were generally silent. They didn't come to Gorbachev's aid. They didn't like this whole perestroika game. They thought it was much too dangerous. Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan eventually rejected it, but not immediately. Following the coup, the Communist Party lost power, lost its stature. Now, Nazarbayev, who was obviously the head communist in Kazakhstan, depoliticized the state security apparatus and justice, perhaps to ward off a local coup by hardliners against him. Akayev, who was the head of Kyrgyzstan at this point, nationalized the local Communist Party headquarters. Several days after the coup, all the Central Asian leaders called for the departyization. They wanted to get rid of the Communist Party, which most of them were top members of. So independence movements in Central Asia really only gained strength after this August 1991 coup. It was clear to all of them that independence was a huge can of worms. It could hurt the economy, it could encourage greater ethnic tensions, it could unleash new political forces in society, for example, nationalists or religious movements, which we'll talk about later in the class. Communist Party members had developed these local power networks by then, and so they were prepared to remain in power if the USSR died. Tajikistan and Uzbekistan relied on these economic clans. Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan had more tribal and clientelistic networks, so these were also largely economic. All these leaders had, under late glasnost, been patrons to local interests. Linguistic, religious, cultural, they'd been catering to locals rather than Moscow. And so they were building themselves a support base from within. Only Kyrgyzstan actually succeeded in peacefully moving away from the Communist Party pre-independence. They had the election of Akayev, who was this unknown that everyone could accept. The rest, though, all kept their Communist Party first secretaries, who became the presidents of their republics and then their independent states. Let me see what we are on time. Oh, we still have plenty of time. So, independence looked a little bit different for each of the rulers of these republics. In Kyrgyzstan, for Akayev took this radical liberal direction, which was different from all the others. It was this policy of immediate democratization and economic reform, so much closer to the shock therapy model, where you do everything at once. And this lasted for a while until he tasted power, and then he kind of backed off by the mid-1990s. Nazarbayev was also on this. He also considered himself, quote, an Asian liberal. Think about the Asian tigers in the late 1990s, South Korea, for example, where you had limited democracy and these astounding economic results, and then they eventually democratized. So this is the direction that Kazakhstan wanted to go for. Let's have economic reform first, then when we can afford it, we'll have democracy. In Uzbekistan, you had this more conservative come authoritarian leadership, where Karimov maintained power, I should say, demanding a strong state to guide the entire process. So eventually we'll have gradual democratization, but don't count on it anytime soon. In Turkmenistan, there was this policy of national self-reliance. It was a resource-rich country. In fact, Republic, becoming a country. And the Turkmen leadership under Niyazov expected that they were going to gain huge dividends because now they could finally sell their gas at market rates, which were estimated to be, I think, around 50% higher at the time. And so they thought they were going to do great, and they were going to be nationally self-sufficient, self-reliant, and they weren't going to need anyone else. And then in Tajikistan, you really had the fracture of the state as you had this internal contest for power, which we'll talk about very, very soon. One of the lessons from the state-building literature, in general, if you've taken 260, is that if you have no struggle, if you have no external threat, it can be more difficult to build a strong state. And you didn't really have these external threats in Central Asia. But there were significant issues facing Central Asia upon independence. One was security. And so Afghanistan here was at the forefront. And some of the Central Asian states sought to use Afghanistan as an external threat, even though it wasn't necessarily a direct external threat from the beginning. Here you've got the threat of terrorism, Islamic fundamentalism, just over the border. Soon, Tajikistan breaks out into civil war. And so here people are saying, watch out for allowing too many sources of political opposition, people being the rest of the leaders in the Central Asia. So we don't want too much political opposition because some of them are devious, they've got sinister plans for the state. This is another way of showing that they've got a security dilemma. With Tajikistan came Russia. Russian peacekeepers came in there, and now we need to protect ourselves from recolonization. Another thing that was celebrated or frequently discussed in certain republics of Central Asia, or certain now independent states of Central Asia. And finally, you've got unstable borders, these threats from various new states, minorities that could well try to break away, non-state actors that could try to create their own states. So all these perceived or imagined threats, terrorism, Islamic fundamentalism, the threat of Russia coming back from within Tajikistan to go everywhere, were used to justify crackdowns and these lapses in democratic practice across the region. Perhaps the most important area where new leaders would be tested, though, was in the economic sphere. And I will take this in a separate set of slides.